Hello, my name is Dominic Underhallhouse and welcome to another episode of Moonbreaker. In today's episode we're going to be doing something that I've seen done for almost every other game that you can think of, but I've not seen one done quite yet for Moonbreaker, so I thought let's give it a shot and see what we think, and that is the good old tier list. So I've got every member of the crew here, not the captains. I will give it a little captain rundown at the end, but in general the crew here are what we're going to be looking at. And we've got everything from S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier. It's all in alphabetical order. And then what we're essentially going to be saying is S tier is just the cream of the crop. The best units, if you're hard pushed to find a list that could play them, that doesn't play them. A tier is the ones that, you're almost always going to see in the relevant lists. B tier is sort of, here and there you see it. You see it sometimes. C tier is a rare option. You're not going to see it too often, but you're going to see it sometimes, but quite rarely. And then D is the ones you almost never see. So there's going to be... So I've had a little look through these. I think there's going to be a few in every category. We might move them around, but this is how I feel the format has gone so far. And this is all entirely my opinion. There's bound to be people here that disagree with me. Feel free to let me know what you think, whether you think, I've done it right. Most likely if you think I've done it wrong. But let's just see where we think things are going to sit. So we might as well crack into it. In fact, what I'll do is I'm going to quickly give a captain rundown first, because I think that's, a very important thing to bear in mind. In the current state of play, there's sort of a S tier, A tier, B tier of captains. S tier is going to be Zax for me. Zax is just sort of ubiquitous. He's everywhere. Everyone plays a Zax list with Zax aggro. The 2 damage at range is actually what most people think is high value on Zax. Personally, I also love the rest of his kit, the mines and the AoE sort of pull. Really, really useful. For A tier, we go into Astra. Now, I think Astra is just a lot harder to use. There's a lot more practice required for people to really master Astra, myself included. But I think the ramp ability and the charge has got so many ways that she can sort of change the way the game is played that it does really compete quite well. And then sadly, even for those Extilior mains in the Discord, we love you all, but I'm pretty sure Extilior falls into the B tier. I think at the moment, without him being able to get straight into range, I think he really struggles. That's my opinion. Other people might have found things differently. But again, this falls into my playstyle, so I think that's how I think things tend to end up. Now, let's move on to the units. So the first one I'm going to look at is the Aegis Defense Dome. So with Aegis Defense Dome, it's not something that goes in every list, and in every list that is defensive, they're not necessarily going to take it either. However, it's probably one of the 2 best, maybe 3 best defensive units in the entire game. Because if you're playing it in an Astra list, you can potentially get it out early. If you're running Escape Hatch, this is always going to be your option, and it's one of the best Escape Hatch options as well, because it taking 2 damage isn't that relevant, because the whole point of it is to protect other things. So if your other things haven't taken the damage, it's great. If you play it in an Escape Hatch list as well, it also reduces the damage that your other units take if they land inside it. Combine it with an armor unit, you get units that are nearly impossible to kill without dealing with it first, and there's a couple of synergies later on, including our 6 Neck Divine, that just mean that it's a really difficult situation for any list to sort of break through a Defense Dome Neck Divine setup, as long as you've got any reasonable amount of damage. So for me, I think it's A tier. It's not in every list, but it's one of the better defensive units going. Next, we're going to look at the Aegis Sentinel, and here's the thing at the moment is immobile units really don't have that much of a place. With objectives coming around the corner, then there's absolutely a chance for that to improve. If you can sit it on an objective and hold it from people, that makes it a lot better. But also, given that other players often take the movement assists, even if you can take one as well, there's every chance that you're forced to use yours to put it into a better position, whereas the opponent can use theirs to just tuck yours behind a bit of terrain. So I think, unfortunately, the Sentinel, I've not seen it in any real competitive lists. It's going to be a D tier for me. I'm sorry, Sentinel, I do love you, but I think this is about right. So next we've got Amplifier Bytol. So initially Amplifier Bytol was seen as a little bit of a niche unit. It wasn't initially considered that highly. Now, I think every single list that makes good use out of Bytol should be running Bytol. It's incredible value for Force Cinder. If you think about it, essentially anything in an AoE has the instant impact. And in the current format, instant impact is so important because there isn't that much of it. so anything that has an impact immediately is really, really valuable. And for me, Bytol can often be 4 Cinder to put out 3 extra damage, sometimes even 4. It works really well with Maximus and Rickety and other units that are in a lot of lists. So for me, Bytol actually moves all the way up to our first S tier unit of Moonbreaker. I'm going to think it's going to be very unlikely that we see many lists that are aggressive that don't run Bytol, also fantastic at pushing through armour. Next we're on to Antios Gauntlet. So Antios is a bit of a strange place because it works really well in some aggressive lists, but I think the lists now have sort of moved away from just running lots of 1-drops to moving to specific targeted units, so there's a lot more sort of variation in what they're going to pick now. It was previously just all the cheap units, however it's still seen quite a lot. I'm unsure where he fits. The ability to do 4 damage in conjunction with things like Drum Dancer Talali is really powerful because then it goes up to 8. And I think he's hovering around sort of B to A tier at the moment. What I think I'm going to do is I'm going to pop him in B tier for now, but I think there's a chance he could move up to A tier by the end of the video because I'm going to go over everything at the end and have a little bit of a look. So I think B tier for the moment, but he could be bumped up to A tier in the right circumstance. Next, we've got Arya. So Arya is basically one of the sort of units that needs a buff the most, in my opinion. And I think a lot of units that aren't played very often are basically what I'd consider to be sort of their niche picks, and they don't necessarily have a home. Whereas Arya, to me, just feels slightly underpowered. There's another unit in here, Deadeye, and Deadeye essentially does almost the same thing, because it's Arya can only ever buff herself and Deadeye can buff something else. It's less of a buff, but it's still very, very powerful. So for me, Arya, I think she just falls a little bit short, and honestly, I think you rarely see her. I can see a world in which you might want to play her in some sort of range list, but she's very close to hitting that D tier. Just one of those units that need to buff. Axel Pyro is next, and Axel I think has been seeing a bit of a resurgence as people have realised quite how powerful the burn is, especially in an AoE. So essentially, for 1 Cinder to activate, you deal 2 damage immediately, and then you deal 1 damage a turn for 3 turns. Now I think Axel has actually been buffed recently by the changes to other unit costs. So with Blindsider Esli going to 3, and with Savria Safeguard going to 3 as well from 4, it means that you can now curve Axel Pyro into another unit and still make good use of your Cinder, whereas previously there weren't that many good 3-drops, so you play Axel Pyro and the next turn you'd waste a Cinder if you wanted to activate it. So for me, I actually think Axel's moved all the way up to A tier now. I think it's very rare to see many lists that couldn't benefit from Axel. The downside is it's very hard to play, needs a lot of good positioning, using that little knockback on his flamethrower is quite difficult, but is a really powerful ability. So personally, I think Axel is moving up to A tier. 5 damage to multiple units for 1 Cinder is an incredible investment, even if he only gets to attack once. If you get to attack twice, it's unbelievable. Really good value there. So next we've got Beatrice. So Beatrice is actually my favourite unit in the game at the moment. I love her, I think she's fantastic. Having a 2-drop with armour is incredible already because it slows down so many of the aggressive lists, but also having it with 7 health and just being a big base. So that's one of the really important things, is that some of these units are small base, some of them are large base, but most of them it doesn't matter that much. One of the ones it does matter on is Beatrice. She's incredible, and if you can ever find yourself getting in range of an enemy's Broken Vengeance where something else is lined up behind it, my favourite interaction in the game, using Beatrice and Broken Vengeance to go back and forth. She deals 2 in a line behind him, he deals 1 in return because of the armour, and you just chain that until either him or the unit behind him is dead. It's fantastic. So I think Beatrice is probably the single best defensive unit in the game. She requires a lot of positioning to use. You have to find the right angles. Quite often you end up using her like movable terrain instead of actually like a unit in herself, but for me, Beatrice makes it to S tier. I don't see any defensive list not playing Beatrice. Even in my Astra list where I'm ramping straight to 4 Cinder on turn 2, on turn 3 I'm playing Beatrice and playing a Cinder Orb. She's just incredible. Next up we've got Blindsider Esli. So Esli for 3 Cinder has basically the most damage you can get on any unit in the game without actually spending any Cinder. So what I mean by that is spending it on the ability. So you do need to spend your Cinder to get Blindsider Esli up to 4 damage, but nothing else in the game can get to 4 damage without using Amplifier Bytol, so that's absolutely incredible. The fact it gets fast, the fact it's efficient early on, it's a fantastic unit. Blindside Wrestler is going to be A tier for me, very, very close to sort of S tier, but that 3 cost does prohibit him from a few different lists. Next we've got Broken Vengeance. So Broken Vengeance is actually one of my other favourite units, but unfortunately he falls down a little bit on being a 4-drop in a world where there's actually just some really good 4-drops. There's not many, but the ones there are better than him, and it's a bit of a shame, but his ability to damage crew that damage him is great, but if you're playing him on turn 2 with an Astra, your opponent is just not going to shoot him with Maximus, and that's the only sort of thing that you want to do. So if I can see him going up in the future when we get things like objective-based play, same with the static defences, same with Beatrice, but for now, I think you're rarely going to see Broken Vengeance. I love him, I play him in a lot of lists, but I don't think he quite makes it. Next up we've got Chuck and Co. So Chuck and Co is very much a utility unit. It's quite tanky, it's got armour, it's got the toss ability to throw things away, but there's another unit with armour with a ranged attack coming up later on in Shrapnel, and I think Chuck just falls down a little bit in comparison. It's still a very powerful tanky unit, but for me, I think Chuck sits solidly in the B tier. I wouldn't begrudge anyone putting him in a list. Having that 2 damage is useful, the extra on with toss, and can be a good bit of utility, but all in all, I don't think he's going to be the most sort of solid all-round unit. I think he's just absolutely fine, but never really going to stand out and shine in most games. Sometimes he will, but not always. Next up we've got Crankbait. So Crankbait is a fantastic character in Zax's story, was amazing, really entertaining, like great bit of lore, great bit of voice acting as well. Whoever did Crankbait, great job. However, Crankbait is just not that useful. So having fast and the grappling chain is great, but there's other ways of getting movement that just feel more effective, and pulling one unit over to you at the moment isn't as useful as it could be. So pulling a unit, yours forwards or theirs back, it doesn't add up to as much value as other things like Quetzali and just having that flexibility to use multiple movements. So for me, Crankbait is going to be in C tier. Again, another one that might benefit from objective play, because from what we know, the scores are going to be at the beginning of your turn. You score for objectives you hold, and Crankbait can pull people straight off of them. So C tier for Crankbait, maybe looking at a big boost in the future. Next up we've got Crosshair. So Crosshair is a fantastic damage unit, but the problem is that Crosshair needs to basically be on the battlefield as early as possible to really get maximum use out of it. One of the old things we used to see with Crankbait was playing it with Taria Arsenal, but with a drop in people playing Taria, I think Crosshair has slightly dropped as well. I think Crosshair could sit solidly in B tier. There's arguments for pushing Crosshair in either direction, but I think she just sits around here. If your opponent plays cheap units, there's a chance she can one-shot them on the turn they drop if they've got 5 health. It's sort of, it's reasonable, but given that you can't even into the breach it with Astra because her ability says she has to have been on the battlefield, makes it quite difficult. But being able to play to hit recently deployed units for a lot of damage takes her, I think, out of C tier and into the B tier. Next we've got Deadeye. So Deadeye is the 2-drop of choice across most lists. I can't think of many lists I've played that don't run Deadeye whatsoever. I think Deadeye's fantastic. It's 2 damage for 2 Cinder, and for an additional Cinder you basically guarantee a hit on either yourself or something else. It's a very straightforward unit, but it's also one of the most efficient. Just get more damage on the board, don't worry about too much, it's consistent, it's reasonably sort of solid in every way, shape and form. I can't remember many lists that don't run Deadeye. Deadeye is actually going to be S tier for me. A really, really high choice. I'm surprised by this, I didn't think it would be, but Deadeye absolutely runs up there. So, next up we're going to be looking at Detonia. So Detonia is our 2 damage, 8 health, which is I think some of the most health on a 2-drop. Technically Beatrice has less, but with armour she basically has more. But Detonia's a lot of solid health, but that's to make up for the fact she doesn't have an attack, she only has an ability to damage. I think Detonia is better than I thought she was. I don't think she's top tier, I don't think she's A tier, but I think solidly B tier, because she helps you just get those last points of damage into areas you otherwise couldn't. But I don't think she's, a solid all-round choice every single time. I think she just sometimes has uses, especially if you know that your opponents can play a Maximus and you can afford the Cinder to damage it over a wall or something. Our next look at is Drum Dancer Tlali. So Tlali is going to be a difficult one because Tlali works in specific lists, but in those lists is really important. Outside of those lists is pretty worthless, and I think it's a really interesting choice. So she's very similar to Antios Gauntlet, because if you're running one, there's a good chance you're running both. She works amazingly well with Blindsider Estli, but the other units that she works with are a little bit more sort of Cinder intensive or awkward to play, so things like Toxoid or Mequani Thicket. So for me, I think Tlali is one of the first things that people started dropping in the aggressive lists, and I think it's no longer Tlali being an A tier. I think it's close, but people aren't just rushing out every single time to play Tlali really early on. I think Tlali is similar to Antios in being between A tier and B tier, so I think I'm going to put Tlali just... Let's put Tlali just a hair behind. There you go. Couldn't decide myself there. Just behind Antios. Again, condition of maybe moving these two up and down, but this is about where I feel like they belong at the moment. Next up, we've got Fate Twister Tantan. So Fate Twister Tantan is the one that gives the ability for something of yours to always hit or something of theirs to always miss. Unfortunately, that's not really that relevant in the meta at the moment. If we were seeing more Taurian Guardian, who's coming up later on, I could see us seeing a lot more Fate Twister Tantan. If people were trying to play the Furia combo, where you stack her damage up over and over again and then make her unable to miss, I agree, Fate Twister Tantan would likely be a good choice. Unfortunately, at the moment, none of those things are happening, and he's too squishy to survive on his own. Essentially, all you can do is if you put Fate Twister Tantan on one corner of the map with one enemy unit, sure, it can hold that unit out forever, but eventually that's just not going to be enough and you're taxing yourself one Cinder per turn to do so. There's absolutely going to be synergies with him in the future. I don't see a world in which Fate Twister Tantan doesn't see play eventually, but for now I think he's sitting solidly in the D tier. Next up, we've got Florio Lancer. So this is another one of mine and many people's favourite units, and I've got some bad news for you. I've not seen Florio be that good in many occurrences. Even in my slower lists, I think he struggles sometimes. I do think he's worth at least a reasonable positioning, because having that 3 damage AoE at huge range is really useful, but I see people a lot of the time playing him too early and then basically feeling like they have to invest 4 Cinder every turn, not develop the board, and have fall further and further behind. So I think Florio is actually just solidly B tier. I think there are worlds in which Florio could be better. I think in certain lists like Astra lists he can be a little bit better off, but for now I think B tier is about where he belongs. I want him to be better. I'd love to have some sort of ability in the game to reduce other ability costs, and for me that would make Florio unbelievably fun. Next up, we're on Furia. So there's a couple of uses for Furia, one of which is the combo we mentioned earlier, where you try and stack up her damage and kill the enemy captain in one hit. The other option is to basically use her as a one-time use to deal 5 damage to a unit. Most of the time if you're doing that, you get to do it every other turn, but she's damaging herself and she's also quite squishy, and most people can immediately evaluate the threat of a 5 damage unit dropping on the board. Honestly, I think Furia nearly drops down to D tier. I mean, I haven't seen a single good list running her. Like, I've seen fun lists, I've had fun with her, I've enjoyed it, but I think Furia actually falls all the way down here. I don't think Furia is viable at the moment at all. I think she's very close to it. We just need better defensive options, but with the aggro meta, Furia's just not fast enough. For 5 Cinder, you can play 2, sometimes 3 other units that have more immediate impact than Furia does, and it just doesn't work out efficiently, especially if you need to take a few turns for her to stack up. I think damaging herself isn't as much of the issue. It's the fact that it's so slow before it can do anything, and your opponent's going to be all up in your face. So whether you are damaging yourself or not, chances are they can probably kill her the turn she drops if they really need to. Most of the time they'll just ignore her and go for your face. So Furia, D tier for me. It makes me sad, but I think that's correct. Next up, we've got Jailbreak. So Jailbreak is an interesting position, because I think Jailbreak is going to get better as the game changes. So for now, Jailbreak immobilizing units falls foul of the fact that not only are the best two assists in the game Vortex and Disruptor Beam, which is something I might do a little tier list on later on, but he falls foul of both of those, and Zax's basic attack knocks things out of coherency with it, so it's sort of, it won't be in base contact anymore after a Zax melee attack, like basic attack in melee range, and Zax is the most played captain in my experience. So as much as I think Jailbreak could be good when eventually, if things like the movement assists get a slight nerf, maybe a longer cooldown, if there's other captains, it means Zax sees less play, I think Jailbreak could quite quickly rise in the ranks, but for now, Jailbreak is a solid D tier. It's sad, but I think that's where he lives. Next up, we've got Maximus. I don't think I need to say too much about Maximus. If anyone saw my stream that I did a week or two ago, Maximus was in 12 out of 12 lists that our opponents played. We were keeping track of them, and he was in every single list. He's probably the most powerful unit in the game in terms of just raw value. You play him on turn 1, he does great. You play an Astra and you play a Cinder Orb turn 1. If you need to another turn, you can play a Maximus with Into the Breach and get damage out of nowhere and still hide again. His ability to be safe means Cinder Infusion is fantastic on him. Maximus is undeniably an S tier, but I'm actually going to put him right at the front. Maximus is probably the most S tier unit out of everything in the game at the moment, and I can't even begin to think of, where we can go to bring Maximus down again. Even things like giving a second movement slow would still be really powerful. Next up, we've got Mequani Thicket. So Thicket currently only has one home, and that's in a very specific version of the Astra Into the Breach list, where you can give it haste, poison something, and then attack it with Astra to kill it and move again. But honestly, at 6 Cinder, you're having to spend 8 for that combo on its own. If you just play it at 6 Cinder, it doesn't have armor or anything like that. It just gets chewed away very quickly, and even then, it doesn't. It only takes 2 damage off of things or poisons them. And it does mean that you can get poisoned through armor, which is really nice, but honestly, Mequani Thicket falls foul of just its own cost to me and goes all the way down to D tier. I think it could do with even more health, and that would be a really solid unit, but 10 health dies so quickly to aggressive lists. A little bit more could really give it, big upside there. Next up is Necker Hall. So Necker Hall is the fast unit. You can pay 2 Cinder to put something back to your hand again and restore it fully. It's going to be an incredible tool for control matchups if you ever get to that situation, but at the moment control matchups are few and far between, and even then I'm not sure Necker Hall is what you need if you just need to apply a bit more pressure. So for now, Necker Hall sits solidly into D tier. You're not going to see it. It's just, it's fine in some Astra lists again for combos with returning to your hand, Into the Breaching, attacking again, but most of the time Necker Hall just doesn't give you enough value for its cost. We're moving on now to the Aegis Bulwark. So Bulwark is another of the immobile units, and then again, like we said earlier, immobile units really do suffer a bit at the moment. They're lacking a bit of use, really, because a lot of the things that are good about immobile units in general is that they'd be able to cover a certain area of the battlefield, but given that there's no real reason to pull units towards a certain area at the moment without any objectives, the stationary units in general tend to be pretty low tier. So we're going to move the Bulwark back down again into the D tier. It just doesn't live up to what it does. Also, in my opinion, probably one of the most overcosted units in the game. I honestly wouldn't even be that impressed by Bulwark if it cost 4 instead of 6. So I think that's something that's still a huge consideration. I think it's going to fall down. I think it could get better, with objectives, but for now it's fallen all the way down here. Next up, we're going to look at Peacemaker Balam. So Peacemaker Balam is an unusual one because I think it's better than people give it credit for. Essentially, the ability to to stun units in a small AoE. My record is actually stunning 4 units every single turn for 2 Cinder, which is absolutely absurd. It doesn't stun captains, it only stuns crew, but it's a really, really strong effect. The problem is it's Cinder intensive, and in the current meta it doesn't do enough to affect the board state. I really, really want Balam to be a B tier, but I think C tier is probably correct. I think it's still more useful than anything in the bottom. Sometimes if you get in an aggro matchup, you can just stun 2 units a turn for 2 Cinder, that's essentially the same as killing them. You know, it doesn't really have any sort of negative effect whatsoever. It's such a powerful, such a powerful effect, but it's just slow, and you need to hit 2 units to really make it worthwhile, in my opinion, and that's kind of hard to set up without the right assists. Next up, we've got Quetzali. So, Quetzali might surprise people as to where I'm putting it here, but the more I see Quetzali in play, the more I think I've sort of figured out the right spot for it. If you know anything about the way that I like to play things like 40k, or the way I even play Moonbreaker, I think movement abilities are so powerful because it really gives you that sort of positional advantage on the board, and I think it's underrated even now a lot of the time. For me, Quetzali, and especially after having seen Jester's rickety backfire list recently, Quetzali is going to be going in S tier. I mean, I'm struggling to find a world in which Quetzali isn't just a great finisher. I've noticed that in things like aggro matchups, when you've got enough damage on the board but your opponent's found a good way to turtle up, you can just play Quetzali, get all your units into a better angle, get that extra damage through. If you're playing an Extilior list, it's almost just a must. You can't get into range without using it. There's the rickety backfire list from Jester, where you use this to get rickety into range really early on, deal damage, and then run away again. It's really, really powerful. I think, as it stands, people are only going to find more and more uses for Quetzali, and honestly, with the health it's got, it feels very difficult to take down, even when it's on the battlefield with no attack, because it feels like, can I afford to spend my turn taking down a movement unit rather than taking damage off the board? And I think people will get better at prioritising it, but even I do it wrong all the time. So I think Quetzali is probably one of our S tier units. Next up, we've got Rickety Backfire. So Rickety can offer the most damage per turn of any unit in the game as it stands. So on its own, Rickety Backfire can do up to 6 damage, 3 with the attack, 3 with the explosion. If you're adding something like Amplifier Vital, that's 4 with the attack and 4 with the explosion, because the explosion also benefits from your attack, because it just says it damages unit in range, not does 3 damage units in range. Next one is Taria Arsenal, if you happen to play that in your list as well. That gets doubled again, because the explosion happens on activation on that as well. So essentially, if you had Vital, Rickety Backfire and Taria all together, you could be looking at getting a total of 16 damage, which is utterly mad. But on top of that, even the base damage of 6 alone to the face in a game where your opponent only has 20 health, likely that's going to be enough to swing the game in your favour. I think Rickety Backfire genuinely does sit all the way up in S tier, because not only is it great in offensive lists, but if you're trying to be defensive, this is one of the only units that can in one attack take out a lot of the aggro crew from the enemy. So really, really powerful unit. I think probably I don't think people get used to how he works until you've played quite a few games and you start seeing the explosions go off. As soon as you do, I think you want to play Rickety in most lists. I do. I've been trying to avoid it just because of how powerful it is, and I like to sort of have a bit of variety and play sort of more fun lists, but Rickety is unbelievable. Can't recommend him enough. Highly recommend you put it in your lists and practice using him. Difficult to use, but one of the most powerful units going. Next up, we've got Savria Safeguard. So, Savria is one of our core sort of defensive units. She recently got a buff. She's down to 3 Cinder instead of 4, and she can reduce damage down to 0 for 1 attack per turn. I think with all of those, she fits solidly in the C tier. She's a 3 Cinder melee unit, and she has to complete things like Blindside or Estley. As it turns out, if you just kill your enemy units with Estley, they do just as much damage reduction as dealing 0, because a dead unit does 0 and they're just 1 less on the board. It doesn't make sense to me to play Savria when things like Estley exist. There are worlds I could see where it's going to be valuable, but mostly I think she belongs in the C tier. You'll very rarely see her. Next up, we've got Shrapnel. So Shrapnel is one of the best anti-aggro units outside of Beatrice, because not only does she have armor, which is super valuable versus aggro lists, but also the AoE effect, again compared with Amplifier Vital, which Vital again proving her worth constantly. Shrapnel really does just start to clear house very early on. I don't see many lists trying to beat aggro without running Shrapnel. In my Astra list, Shrapnel is almost always my turn 4 play. Shrapnel is going to go into A tier. Fantastic defensive unit. Really not going to have many defensive lists where you don't take use of that as well. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is Snareling. So, Snareling is one of the units that was my favourite when I first started playing. If you're coming against a lot of Extiliors, which might happen in the future, Snareling's fantastic. Stopping their captain from advancing means they can't deploy as far up, they can't get into range. But most of the things in this game, if you can hit Snareling, they can hit you back. Ranged is king at the moment with a lot of the units, so even though we've put sort of some shorter range units up the top, range is still reigning supreme. I think Snareling falls into C tier. You don't see it, and when you do, it's sometimes annoying, but most of the time 1 damage just means that they spent 3 cinder for something that's not affecting the board that much, and if you've got a blindside Wrestly instead, you're usually happier. And with movement assists as well, it's not that hard to sort of get some movement even with Snareling's immobilised you as well. Next up, we've got Stitchy McPatchy. So the Resident Helobot looks a little bit, kind of weird in the eyes. I have not seen many good Stitchy lists whatsoever. There is a good healing option we'll get to later on, but Stitchy, for a 2-drop with 1 attack, I think there's an argument that Stitchy could be good with 2 attack. I mean, I don't think it would be too much of an issue. I think Stitchy is unlikely to be getting into melee range anyway, but when he does, having a little bit more impact would be good. But without any changes, I think Stitchy sits solidly down in D tier as well. I've not seen any of these units in many lists. Next up, we've got Switchback. So in the previous version of Astra, Switchback was absolutely the finisher of choice. You could play him down really cheap, give it into the breach. You could also go ahead and give it rapid fire and deal 6 damage out of nowhere. It's dropped down slightly because of how Astra's changed. It's still a really powerful unit, but not quite anywhere up into the A tier. I wouldn't begrudge anyone for running it as sort of like a B tier as a sometimes unit, but honestly I think most people run different units as finishers. So I think we're looking at C tier for Switchback. Genuinely one of the most powerful units in the game, but just doesn't quite compare with the things above it. Next up is Taria Arsenal, and this is a story of a fall from grace. Taria's use now has basically been solely resigned to people wanting to run the Rickety Backfire combo. She was borderline before. She would have been S tier or A tier. Losing 1 attack has really taken her out of place in those aggro lists. So I think Taria has fallen quite drastically. I'd put her, it's either B or C. I don't feel like she sees any play whatsoever here, but I think she still deserves B tier because in the right situation, especially with things like Rickety Backfire, but then also potentially Shrapnel or Crosshair, really good value. And I could see a list actually that I quite like the idea of, just come up with the top of my head, is running a Taria list with these two and seeing if we can make something fun work on that front. So there is absolutely value to Taria. She's dropped down a lot. She would have been S tier previously. She doesn't make it into most of the aggro lists anymore, so hence why she's behind the other aggro units, but still fairly reasonable if you need her to be. I'd say she's bottom of B tier, but not the worst. Just she's more of a support unit than a aggro unit anymore. Next up, we've got Tipu, everybody's favourite brain chicken. Tipu I actually think is better than people give him credit for, however, should only really exist in an Astra list. Tipu doesn't do well in other lists, it just doesn't. You place it out there, people know immediately to be scared of it, they kill it as soon as they can, or they kite it out for the rest of the game. Tipu is going to be solidly B tier, just only in an Astra list. If you're looking at other lists, I'd say C tier. It's a wonderful unit, I love Tipu, doesn't belong any higher than this. Next up, we've got Tona Mystic Manteo. So Tona is the no attack unit that just heals you equal to the amount of unspent Cinder at the end of your turn. I think this is solidly a D tier unit. I can't justify not spending Cinder, because obviously you can carry over 3 per turn, but then you're always just having 3 unspent Cinder if you want to make good use out of it, and to heal your captain. If your position when your captain's that low, this is a good turnaround mechanic, but only if you've already stabilised the board, and the fact it only heals your captain makes this really, really limited. I could see worlds in which this does come back and become sort of a played unit, but for me at the moment it's only good in an Extilior list, and even then very, very rarely, because you're better off just trying to find other ways to kill them. Next up we've got Taurian Guardian, another one of my previous favourite units. Taurian is really, really useful, however, compared to the aggro meta and sort of the speed of it, I think Taurian doesn't quite do enough for the 4 Cinder. I think Taurian is going to be another one that will improve with objective-based play, but for now, I think Taurian sits at C tier. You'll rarely see Taurian, but sometimes when you do, it just feels so awkward. And I think one of the reasons that Taurian sits down here is because things like Florio exists higher up, Axel Pyro exists higher up, and both of these ignore the reduced damage effect anyway, so it makes it a lot more sort of difficult for it to hold value when some of the better units that are being played regularly actually just ignore the ability completely, as does things like Extilior's Spin. It doesn't quite line up, and again, the prevalence of movement assists means you can move Taurian out of range of the enemy almost whenever you need to, as long as you have one of those as well. So Taurian falls down to C tier, hasn't quite fallen as far as Jailbreak, because their ability is, in my opinion, more likely to be relevant than Jailbreak's a lot of the time, because reduced accuracy to hit still affects itself as well. So Taurian's probably even tankier than Jailbreak, but still a very awkward unit to use, given that some of the abilities are so strong. Next we've got Toxoid. So Toxoid is another unit that I'd say is an Astra specific unit. It's fantastic for just Into the Breach, give poison something, reduce down to 1 attack. So Toxoid is going to be better than Mequani Thicket. They functionally have the same job in that list, but Toxoid is 3 Cinder cheaper. The gaining health doesn't really matter very often. The only thing that matters is poison and airborne, just to get right in on that unit you need to and reduce it down to 1. Fantastic with Plink, but again, being able to play it without charge, not that valuable. People will just focus it down as soon as they can. Even then, I think it sits solidly in B tier, again with Tipu, because they're only in the Astra lists. Next up, we've got Ursic's Nectarvine. This might surprise a lot of people, especially if you're not used to the game. Nectarvine for me, I'm going to put it there first and explain why, goes in A tier. So Nectarvine is part of, just again with the Defense Dome, the most difficult to deal with defensive combo. If you have both of those on top of a Beatrice, say, you're going to have to kill either the Dome or the Nectarvine first. If you try and kill the Dome, it heals 2 every turn from the Nectarvine. If you try and kill the Nectarvine, it takes 1 less damage every turn from the Dome, and you have to find a way past Beatrice to get to both of them. It's an incredibly strong defensive combo, really stalls out those games, and the fact that Nectarvine again has that instant impact is so valuable. It's 2 healing at the end of your turn, and you don't have to spend any additional Cinder on it. All you have to do is sit nearby. Now, immobile units again have a disadvantage, but the main thing here is that this one's a defensive one, not an offensive one. You're not trying to deal damage with it, so if you really need that ability, you just move back towards it. Given that you have control over what the immobile unit affects, is much, much more useful than the turrets, who the enemy has control over the units they're trying to affect. So because you control both parts of it, you can make better use of Nectarvine than you can do out of the stationary other units. Lastly, we've got our Ursic's Scattervine. Now, if you'd have asked me a couple of weeks ago, Scattervine would have probably seen a C tier or a D tier. It really would. But the more I've seen it played, the more it creeps up and up and up, and I think it solidly sits in A tier now. Only in the aggressive lists, but it's such a good finisher. I've had games where you've got 8 Cinder left, and I've been able to basically play it out, make 3 copies, use 2 of them to come up the board somewhere, 1 to deal a bit of damage, and then use 1 to hide, ready to make more next turn. I've had situations where you play all of them in a turn to just attack the enemy captain. I've had some where you've got second wind, you've got say 10 Cinder or whatever. You can play Bitol out, you can play 2 of these, you get 4 damage immediately, you can place them anywhere, you can get so much movement out of them. Scattervine is going up and up and up in my estimations, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point it moves all the way up to S tier. It's an incredibly good unit. I actually think underplayed all around, and I really think that we're going to see a lot more Scattervine in the future. So this has been my tier list. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm sure there'll be some really strong opinions on this. Some people will think that I'm mad for putting these where I have done. Other people will think I'm bang on. I'm sure that every single person will think I've made at least one mistake, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about all of it. Make sure for now though you hit that subscribe button. We're 120 subscribers at the moment. We're trying to push our way towards that 250 as the next big goal, so I'd absolutely love it if we could share this, but this is how I think the tier list sits in the current format of Moonbreaker. So hit those comments, like, subscribe, all those things that YouTube always asks you to do, but do it for me because we're friends now. The internet made us friends. And other than that, have a good day.